down here for quite a while, over here on our St. Petersburg campus running the Ocean Observing Lab. So without further ado, Mark Luther.
Thank you, Libby. Oops, what did I do with my clicker? There it is. Well, as Libby said, I'm a professor at the USF College of Marine Science, and I run the Ocean Monitoring and Prediction Lab there. And one of the things that we do is put out real-time oceanographic sensors to measure winds, waves, currents, tides, things like that, and send it back in real time. We put it on the internet so that lots of different people can utilize those data, and then we try to build decision support tools, products that people can use to make better informed decisions about doing whatever it is they do that involves the coastal ocean. I got into real-time ocean observing for many of the same reasons that this nice big bridge over the Skyway is. This is just a little schematic of what an ocean observing system is. There are two large national organizations or programs that are going on. One is the Integrated Ocean Observing System, which is, I'll talk a little bit more about in some detail. Another is the Ocean Observatories Initiative, which is a National Science Foundation funded program to build observatories, sort of like astronomical observatories, where there's a lot of infrastructure that's shared by lots of different researchers, that different scientists can come in and hook their own instruments in or use the instruments that are in this observatory to make measurements and then go back and do their science research papers, get them published and that sort of thing. That's the Ocean Observatories Initiative funded by the National Science Foundation. But I work with this group called the Integrated Ocean Observing System that's more practical end user based. So we try to support things like safe navigation or tell the surfers how big the waves are today, those sorts of things. But again, I got into ocean observing for many of the same reasons that nice new bridge is here. In May of 1980, an inbound freighter encountered an unexpected thunderstorm line. The pilot of the vessel was blinded by the rainfall. There were 60-knot winds on the side of the vessel that pushed it out of the ship channel, and it hit one of the main supports of the old Skyway Bridge, knocking it down and killing 35 people, shutting down the southbound lanes of US 19, now Interstate 275. It also closed the ship channel into Tampa Bay. All the ships that come into the port facilities of Tampa Bay have to come under this bridge, with all the wreckage of the old bridge blocking the channel for several weeks. No big ships could get under there. Well, it turns out that between 60 and 70% of all the refined petroleum product plus coal to fire some of the big power plants around the bay have to come under that bridge. They couldn't get in. They were having to stop ships offshore and lighter the cargo, the oil or coal off onto smaller barges that could get under the old drawbridge by Maximo Point to get in. Disney World came close to going dark. People were running out of gasoline in this area because you couldn't get the ships in. So one of the results of that was we started an observing system to give the pilots better information on winds and water levels. One of the critical issues, and ships don't knock bridges down every day, but just day-to-day operations depend on what the winds and tides and currents are doing. You can always predict the tide in advance just by knowing something about the motion of the Earth, the Moon, and the Sun, and their gravitational attraction to each other. But a little bit of wind can completely override the predicted tide. This is an example from one of the so-called storms of the century that we've had over the last couple of decades. This was 1993, March of 1993. We had a big storm, not unlike the superstorm that just hit the Northeast, but it started out over the Gulf of Mexico and was unpredicted because we didn't have any weather buoys out in the Gulf of Mexico at the time. The red line here is the predicted water level just from what we call the astronomical tidal predictions. The blue line is the actual water level observed at the St. Petersburg water level gauge. And the little green arrows are the winds. So as the wind turned around from the south-southwest It was blowing almost 100 miles an hour as this front came through Tampa Bay. It pushed water up into the bay. That's what we call storm surge. The difference between the predicted tide and the observed water level is what we call the storm surge. And so you can see when the predicted tide was supposed to have been about 1.8 feet, the observed tide was almost 6 feet above what we call mean lower low water, which is what we reference all of our tidal measurements to. And in fact, all the streets in my neighborhood, I live just on the other side of Bayou Grande here from Weeden Island in Mermaid Point area, all of our streets were underwater. We couldn't get out. But as the wind shifted a few hours later and now started to blow out of the north-northwest, pushed all the water out of the bay, and so the next predicted high tide later that evening was again supposed to be about 1.6 feet above mean lower low water, but was actually about 1.3 feet below mean lower low water. And so if you were trying to bring a ship in and out of some of the port facilities here, never mind the wind, you wouldn't have been able to get in because there would have been, what, almost 2 feet less water at that port facility than the tide charts or the tide tables would have predicted. So that's why we started measuring these things. We started with help from our local congressional delegation, putting some money into NOAA's budget, working with the National Ocean Service. We built the Tampa Bay Physical Oceanographic Real-Time System, which we simply call PORTS. How many people of you have accessed PORTS before? So a few of you know what it is. This thin blue line is the ship channel that comes in, starts about 5 or 6 miles offshore of Egmont Key out here at the mouth of the bay, runs under the Skyway Bridge, and then branches off into the various port facilities. Port Manatee here, the main port facilities in downtown Tampa here, Old Port Tampa here south of the Gandy Bridge. Tankers carrying fuel oil still come up into here in Weeden Island, even though they've converted the power plant here from fuel oil to natural gas. There's still a pipeline that runs from here to the power plant in Tarpon Springs that still burns fuel oil. So they bring ships or barges full of this thick black number 6 fuel oil into here a couple of times a week that then transfers that oil over to that other power plant. There's also a huge coal-fired power plant over here, the Big Bend plant that you've probably all seen, and then the main port facility here in Tampa. There's also a lot of phosphate material that gets shipped in and out of the Alafaya River right here. So Tampa Bay is one of the top 10 to 15 busiest ports in the U.S. And again, the primary things that get shipped in and out of here are petroleum products, coal for the power plants, and materials for the phosphate industry. Either phosphate or refined fertilizer gets shipped out of here, or chemicals that are used in processing and making the fertilizer get shipped in. One of the most dangerous of those is anhydrous ammonia. There are 2 or 3 big tankers full of anhydrous ammonia that come in here each week and either go into downtown Tampa or into the Alafaya River here. Anhydrous ammonia is extremely deadly stuff. If one of those were to rupture, it could kill everything within a couple of mile radius. Fortunately, that's never happened. We've had some leaks from some pipelines and minor things that have hurt some people, but it's important to know what the winds and waves and tides are when you're bringing this kind of hazardous cargo in and out of a place like this. And again, the ship channel itself is very narrow. It's only about 500 to 600 feet wide. It's about 43 to 45 feet deep. Most of the bay, though, is less than about 10 to 12 feet deep. In fact, the average depth of the bay is only 12 feet. So once a ship passes the entrance buoy to the ship channel out here, it's confined to go all the way to the other end. There's no place for it to turn around. The ship channel's too narrow for most of these ships to turn around. There's no place for them to pull over and anchor. Once they pass buoys 9 and 10 out here off of Egmont Key, they're committed to go all the way to the other end to their final destination. And it's about a 4-hour transit from the entrance to the ship channel to the berths in the main Port of Tampa. So a little bit of wind out of the wrong direction, a little bit of current out of the wrong direction can completely prevent them from making it to their final destination. In fact, going into Port Manatee here, they have to make a hard right turn across the main tidal flow. The tide flows basically up and down the bay at about 2 to 3 miles an hour. Ships turning into here have to make that turn as the tide is changing from flooding or rising tide to a falling tide so that they can get through that little stretch of channel across the current while the speed of the current flow is below about 0.2 of a mile an hour. Otherwise, the current pushes them out of the bay, out of the channel, and they run aground on the very shallow shoals on either side of the channel. So at each of these dots here on the map, we measure either the water level, the wind speed and direction, or the current speed and direction. At a couple of these spots, we also measure the wave height and the visibility, how foggy it is. And all of that data comes in continuously by line of sight radio or by satellite into a receiving station on the roof of our building in downtown St. Petersburg at the College of Marine Science. It gets filtered for quality control and assurance, gets put on the internet, and gets distributed to anybody who wants it. You can call a toll-free phone number, 866-TB-PORTS, and a nice voice will read off all the latest data to you, never more than 6 minutes old. Or you can go to tidesandcurrents.noaa.gov and choose the ports link from the drop-down menu at the top, and you can get to the data that way. Or you can go to our website at USF and see the data there. Tampa Bay was the first system of its kind in the country. It was installed between 1989 and 1992. It went fully operational in 1992 and has been operational ever since. Since Tampa Bay Ports was instituted, we now have 18 different ports that have put in similar systems around the country based in large part on the success of the Tampa Bay system. But Tampa Bay is still the cutting edge, or the leading edge of this real-time ocean observing movement. And this is just an illustration of why this sort of system is so important. Back in the 1950s, ships were only drafted to maybe 20 to 25 feet. Now ships come in routinely drafted to 40 to 43 feet when the ship channel is only 45 feet deep. So they're trying to maximize that under keel clearance, or how much water there is between the bottom of the ship and the bottom of the ship channel. So again, knowing exactly how high the tide is, how hard the wind's blowing, how strong the currents are, is critical for the safe and efficient movement of these vessels in and out of harbors. But that's not the only use for these data. Again, the harbor pilots and the Coast Guard are primary users, but we have a whole host of other users. Windsurfers are one of our biggest users, recreational boaters and sailors, fishermen, but also people who chase hazardous material spills. We're first responders for oil spills in the bay now. Someone from my staff is on call 24/7 just in case there's ever another oil spill in Tampa Bay. Fortunately, most of the spills we've had lately have been very small ones, but we have had some fairly large oil spills or other hazardous material spills in the bay. A lot of the environmental protection agencies use data from the system for basic water quality type monitoring. It's used for storm surge monitoring, prediction, mitigation, for tracking red tides, for managing fisheries or tracking fish spawning, larval recruitment, also for sediment transport and erosion studies, dredging and filling and that sort of thing. We don't do a lot of filling, but we still have to do a lot of dredging in the ship channel to keep it open. And knowing what waves, currents, tides are doing is critically important for doing those sorts of operations. This is a picture of some of the observing stations. This is a tower out in the middle of Tampa Bay by that turn going into Port Manatee. This is the water level gauge up in the Port of Tampa. This is the transmitter for the current sensor that sits in the bottom of the ship channel under the center of the Skyway Bridge. And just examples of some of the data plots off of the website. The wind speed and direction, the water level, and the current speed and direction are all monitored continuously. Again, one of our key customers are the Tampa Bay Harbor Pilots Association. Those are the men and women that meet inbound vessels at that sea buoy offshore of Egmont Key and guide the ship into the harbor all the way to its destination. And then as the ship leaves, they get on it at the dock and they ride it all the way out to the sea buoy again. And they carry little portable pilot units on board, which are notebook computers with GPS and communications. And they receive all of the real-time data on these portable pilot units. This is an example of the screen that you get on the internet that they also receive on these portable pilot units. They also see a nautical chart of the bay and the position and speed and direction of their own ship and every other ship in the bay that carries something called an automated identification system transponder on it that transmits all the global positioning system data from the ship to all other ships within radio range. But this is a screen grab that I did earlier this afternoon. This was at 3:45 local time. And you see the water level at the 4 tide gauges here at Port of Tampa, at St. Petersburg, at Old Port Tampa, and at Port Manatee. There's stars at Port Manatee because for some reason that data wasn't coming in at the time. Then the wind speed and direction and gusts at the places where we measure wind speed, and air and water temperature, barometric pressure, and current speed and direction. Again, it's updated every 6 minutes. Since ports became operational in 1992, statistics show that ship groundings, that is, ships that got out of the channel and ran aground, have decreased by 60%, largely because they have all of these data at their immediate disposal. And an economic benefits study showed that while the operating costs of this system are something around $250,000 a year, the real documented costs of, or documented benefits, economic benefits of the system are somewhere between $8 and $10 million a year. And that's just the real economic costs in savings to marine transportation. If you figured in all of the less quantifiable costs, benefit to the environment, benefit to fishermen who have a better day on the water, those benefits are probably much larger still. Well, we don't just collect the data, we use the data to drive models of the bay so that we can then make predictions. These are some examples of some of those model calculations. The animation here is a storm surge event. The color is water level. The dark reds being 1 meter above normal high tide, or about 3.5 feet above a normal high tide. You can see as this front came through, it pushed a bunch of water up in the bay and caused abnormally high tides throughout the bay. We've used this model to look at various water quality issues. We used it to evaluate the effect of the seawater desalination plant that was built several years ago over by that Big Bend power plant. We've also used it to look at discharges from an abandoned phosphate refining facility over here at Port Manatee. And we use it for basic studies of what we call residence time or flushing of the bay. How do things get flushed out of the bay by the tides, mixing the fresh water that flows in from all the rivers with salty water that gets swept in and out of the mouth of the bay with each tide. And so this is just an animation of sprinkling thousands of little passive particles into the model currents and letting the model currents sloshing them around as the tide comes in and out. And we basically time how long it takes for each of these particles to get swept out of the bay. And that has implications for water quality within the bay, how nutrients get cycled through the bay, how algae blooms get cycled through the bay or not, how red tide blooms get pushed into the bay, or how fish larvae are pushed around or moved around in the bay. Well, based on our successes in Tampa Bay in the early to mid 90s. I teamed up with one of my colleagues, Bob Weisberg, and in part in response to that no-name storm of the century in 1993, we trotted up to Tallahassee with a computer. We didn't have notebook computer in those days. I had this great big workstation and a satchel that I carted around on a hand truck to the state legislature and showed people animations of some of these model things and some of these data. And we got the legislature to appropriate some money to start this coastal ocean monitoring and prediction system. And we began putting more sites up and down the coast of Florida and buoys offshore to make similar types of measurements, but all over the state of Florida. And today, teaming up with other agencies, state and federal agencies, and local entities, we have a fairly dense observing network all around the state of Florida. Teaming up with like-minded people around the country, we've begun to stitch all of these local observing systems together into a national network that we call this Integrated Ocean Observing System. So there are these regional alliances of observing systems like ours around the Gulf and around the Southeast. And then there's a national backbone that stitches all of these regional observing networks together with the federal agency observations to build what we call a truly integrated ocean observing system. That's one component of a global ocean observing system where we get together with people around the world who are doing similar sorts of things and merge all of those data together. Have information from Earth observing satellites that can measure things like sea surface temperature or algae blooms at sea from space, merge those together with in situ observations from buoys and drifters and ships of opportunity to create products, again, on what winds, waves, currents, tides, temperatures, salinities are doing around the globe to provide better informed decision products for anybody who has to make decisions about doing things in the oceans. One of the particular things that's of interest to folks here in the Tampa Bay area, and is particular interest to people in the Northeast right now, is storm surge. And storm surge is, again, that wind-driven wall of water that gets pushed up against the coastline when the winds are blowing hard enough and long enough from the right direction. As I said before, what we call the storm surge is the difference between the normal tide and the observed tide after you filter out the waves. So in this example, if mean sea level is down here and the normal tide was supposed to have been 2 feet above mean sea level, and the observed tide after you average out the waves was 17 feet, that means you had a 15-foot storm surge. But then the waves are piled on top of that, and it's that storm surge and those waves piled on top of it that typically do the most damage in a major storm like Hurricane Sandy that we just experienced. So this is a map off of the National Data Buoy Center's website of all the real-time observations from the Northeast that were operating during Hurricane Sandy over the past week. If we zoom in on the New York area, we're going to look at the tide gauge from the Battery in Lower Manhattan. This is a picture of it before the storm. I have no idea what it looks like now, but it's still reporting, so it didn't get completely destroyed. But if we look at the water level data from that site during Sandy, again, the blue line is the predicted tide from what we know about the motion of the Earth, Moon, Sun system. That's what you would see in any tide table or any tide prediction thing you'd pull up on the web. The red line is the observed water level. As you can see, when it's predicted to be about 4 to 5 foot high tide at around midnight on the 30th, they actually had a 14-foot high tide at that time. And again, the surge is the green line. This, the difference between the red line and the blue line is the green line. And so that means they had, just about a 9-foot surge. But what did the damage was the actual water level, which again was 14 feet above mean lower low water. So that inundated most of Lower Manhattan, flooded all the beach communities. in New Jersey and Long Island and Staten Island. We're going to look at this buoy that's just off the entrance to New York Harbor. This is a picture of what the buoy looks like. It measures winds and waves as well as temperature and salinity. And this is the wave height during that event. Again, as the storm approached, the waves were only about 5 feet high. At the height of the storm, the waves were about 33 feet high. So now you've got a 14-foot storm tide with 33-foot waves on top of that. And that's what did most of the damage along the coastline there. The winds were blowing at about 47 to 48 knots, which is about 52, 53 miles an hour. And in fact, it had wreaked havoc on the Statue of Liberty. One of my teaching assistants sent that to me. I just had to include it. I don't mean to make light of a tragic event, but... Well, closer to home, we have a similar observing network as I showed you just a moment ago around the state of Florida. And again, this is off the NOAA website. The National Data Buoy Center is a branch of the National Weather Service that helps collate all these data. It takes all the data that we collect as part of our USF system, all the data that the National Ocean Service collects, all the data that Everglades National Park collects, and synthesizes them all into one spot where you can get at them, and puts them into the NOAA data gateway so that all the other agencies can have access to them. And you can see here, these are all the different agencies that have contributed data just in this map alone. And if we zoom in on Tampa Bay, this is the water level gauge that's right in St. Petersburg on Bayboro Harbor. This is a picture of it. It sits over there in the Coast Guard station just across from the USF College of Marine Science. I tell people it looks like a porta potty on stilts, but that's actually the house that all of the electronics for the tide gauge sit in, and then there are wind sensors and satellite transmitters and solar panels on top of it, and the water level gauge sits here in this white pipe. And again, it transmits the data both by satellite and by line of sight radio to computers in our lab. And you can see all of the other sites around the Tampa Bay area. All these yellow ones are part of the USF observing network. The red ones are part of Tampa Bay ports. The green ones are from Terracea Bay, where Libby used to work, that I think some of them are still reporting. But if you'll recall, back in June, we had a little thing called Tropical Storm Debbie. It didn't do quite the damage that Hurricane Sandy has been doing up in the Northeast, but it still caused a lot of problems. Oh, let's go back. Again, the blue line is the predicted tide. The red line is the observed tide. On Sunday afternoon, as the storm started approaching, the wind started blowing out of the southwest, and you can see the water level came up fairly quickly from what should have been about a 1.5 to 2 foot tide to an almost 5 foot tide. And again, I live over there on Mermaid Point, and it flooded all the streets around our home. But it didn't go away. It stayed for almost 4 days. So from Sunday afternoon till sometime Wednesday morning, the water level was above 3.5 to 4 feet and kept all of the roads up in the Shore Acres neighborhoods underwater. We were stranded at our house for all that time. Fortunately, the power never went out. My internet connectivity never went out, so I was able to keep working. But it kind of got stir crazy after a couple of days. We ran out of tonic water, and somebody had to, the big truck had to resupply us so we could keep drinking running tonics. But anyway, so that's our little piece of the observing system. But there are lots of other things that we would like to measure. In fact, these are all what we call the core variables that we want to measure as part of one of these real-time global ocean observing systems. Things like temperature, salinity, sea level, waves, currents, heat flux, which means temperature, salinity, sea ice, how deep the water is, how clear is the water, how much nutrients are in the water, how much oxygen is in the water, other chemical contaminants. and things like fish species in abundance, zooplankton, phytoplankton, and waterborne pathogens. Okay, well, these are the things that we can measure, the ones in green. These are the ones that we can sort of measure, but not in an automated way continuously for long periods of time. And these are the things that the only way we can measure is by going out there with boats and throwing nets over the side and counting the fish and counting the zooplankton and bringing water samples back to the lab and culturing it so we can tell whether or not it was safe to go swimming at Fort DeSoto 3 days ago. So we've established, working with partners around the country, we established something called the Alliance for Coastal Technologies, where we do test and evaluation on new sensor technologies as they come on the market, and to help people in research labs and private industry build better ocean sensors to better measure the sorts of things that we need to measure. And these are just some of the partners, people in the Gulf of Maine, people in the Great Lakes, in Alaska, Hawaii, Monterey Bay. We're the Gulf of Mexico partner. We have partners in Georgia and South Carolina and Chesapeake Bay as well. And so we do things like testing dissolved oxygen sensors or chlorophyll sensors, nutrient sensors, to see how well they really work in real world conditions, to help them transition into becoming part of this national and global ocean observing system. I'm working with a group called the International Seakeepers Society. It was founded by a group of mega yacht owners, people like Paul Allen and his friends, to do good things for the ocean. And one of the things that they did was to build a system that can make measurements, scientific measurements, from their yachts as they're cruising around and send those data by satellite back to shore where they can be utilized as a part of this global ocean observing system. But we've branched out to, We've branched out to putting them on lighthouses, or on these weather buoys, on Coast Guard icebreakers, tankers, and cruise ships, or just out on the end of piers. And the system basically sucks water in through a through hull and runs it through a manifold with a bunch of different sensors on it, gathers up all the data into a little onboard computer, and then sends it out by satellite. It also has meteorological sensors up on the top of the ship that measure wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, rainfall, humidity, things like that. So it gets picked up by this National Data Buoy Center, and then it gets ingested into all the weather forecast models that lead to, the weather forecast that you see on TV and Bay News 9 at the evening newscast. We've also put one on the Weatherbird, the research ship that's operated by the University of South Florida. And during the big BP oil spill, Deepwater Horizon oil spill out here in the Gulf of Mexico, we put a sensor on this system that can measure whether or not there's oil in the water. And this is data from one of those cruises. Red means there's lots of oil, green means there isn't any oil. You can see how well the ship was able to pick up the oil as it went through the oil patch, shown here in gray. This was interpreted from satellite data, but also found some filaments of oil over in here that weren't immediately obvious from satellites or from other observations. The State Department of Environmental Protection has put one of these systems on a small 22-foot Mako, and they can run at 30 miles an hour across Tampa Bay and sample this entire blue line as they run around the bay. There's the intake on the stern of the boat, and make measurements of whatever it is that they care about, mapping out these quantities so they can cover all of Tampa Bay in just a few hours. Here's a total distance of 80 nautical miles that they ran in 4 hours and 45 minutes on this boat. What we're trying to do now is get some money from the fines that are being assessed to BP in the wake of that spill to put more of these systems on ships that crisscross the Gulf of Mexico, notably cruise ships. These are the ship routes for Carnival Cruise Lines, as well as for some oil tankers that run back and forth between Texas and Tampa Bay. We want to get these sensors on board these cruise ships so that we can have early warning for any future oil spills or have all the data that we need to track any future oil spills, particularly in light of the fact that Cuba is now drilling for oil right in this part of the Gulf of Mexico that sits less than 60 miles from Key West. And in fact, the loop current, which feeds the Gulf Stream on the east coast of Florida, forms here in the Yucatan Straits. It loops across the eastern Gulf of Mexico, flows through the Florida Straits and up the east coast as the Gulf Stream, flows right by these oil rigs that are off the coast of Cuba here. If there were ever an oil spill there, like the Deepwater Horizon spill, it would quickly be swept across the Florida Keys and up the east coast of Florida, causing lots and lots of damage. We were lucky in some sense in the Deepwater Horizon spill that most of the oil stayed in this region and did not get caught up in that loop current. Otherwise, we would have had problems from the Keys all the way up to Cape Hatteras. So that's where we stand right now. This is sort of the future of these ocean observing systems, is to try to get more instruments on more platforms wherever we can and bring those data in and then build better information products from those to help people make better informed decisions. So thank you very much, and I'll answer any questions you might have. The question is, what's the cost of one of the Seakeeper 1000s? The basic system installed is about $85,000. It takes, if you put additional systems like the hydrocarbon sensor is an add-on that we've just started putting on them, and those are around $5,000 to $6,000. And then it takes at least annual, if not semi-annual, maintenance and calibration. So we have a lab here where we bring the sensors back and calibrate them and then take them back out into the field to swap out with other sensors to bring back and calibrate them.
Any other questions? Yes.
Do you feel there's sufficient observation sites around the Tampa Bay area to provide those reliable mesoscale models?
The question is, are there sufficient observations around the Tampa Bay area to feed, you're talking about mesoscale meteorological models or ocean models?
Like the currents and how you forecast pollution trajectories, and it seems like the network was somewhat coarse, and I didn't know if
Right.
it works very well.
The ocean is always undersampled. That's always a big problem. And that's why we have to have better models all the time to basically extrapolate from those sparse measurements to predict the winds, waves, currents, tides at the places where we want to know them. We never have enough data, though, I guess is the right answer. We have sufficient data to evaluate the models to make sure that the models are giving us reasonable results. There are other programs going on in Tampa Bay. Hillsborough County has been making monthly samples at something like 56 sites in the bay and another 50 or so sites in the tributaries of the bay since 1974. And so we have those data as well, but they're just monthly snapshots. And you know, things change hourly over a tidal cycle. And so by combining the, what we call the moored or in situ data, continuous monitoring data from these instrumented platforms with those snapshots, we get a much better picture, but it's always going to be incomplete because it's just so cost and labor intensive to make these measurements.
Any other questions? Yes.
Noticing the core variables you weren't measuring PCO2, is that something y'all are trying to put in or talk with?
That's one of the things that this Alliance for Coastal Technologies is working very hard on. We just finished an evaluation of PCO2 sensors. These measure the partial pressure of carbon dioxide in seawater as part of that exchange between CO2 in the atmosphere and the ocean. And how much CO2 is in the water depends or determines ocean acidity. We're now testing pH sensors as well. Yes, those will be added to those core variables When we made up those core variables, it was in 2002, and it was before we really realized what the problem was with ocean acidification. Now that is becoming a big deal, and in fact we're incorporating PCO2 sensors into that Seakeeper system as well. Yes?
How well does the bay flush with the tides?
Question is, how well does the bay flush with the tides? Depends on where you are. And depends on how hard the wind's blowing, depends on how fast the rivers are flowing, how much fresh water is flowing into the bay. If you're anywhere close to the ship channel, it flushes pretty quickly, 10 to 20 days probably on average. If you're up in Old Tampa Bay, north of the Howard Franklin Bridge, it's more like 100 to 160 days. And so, but that changes again with seasons with freshwater inflow. The more freshwater inflow comes into the bay, the stronger the non-tidal circulation is and the quicker the bay flushes. But in the dry season, the bay becomes fairly stagnant in places.
Yeah, I know you're still seeking funding for the hydrocarbon sensors on the cruise ships, but I wonder if you can tell me, it's not really in the news anymore, what, if any, residual effects from the Deepwater Horizon spill are still being measured?
There is an ongoing program from several institutions funded by BP, something called the Gulf Research Initiative. BP gave that initiative $500 million that's been parceled out to several different groups to monitor those long-term effects. And there are some long-term effects. In fact, probably half of the oil that was spilled, we don't know where it went. And a lot of it's still out there because a lot of it was dispersed at depth, both chemically and simply because oil was spewing at high pressure out of a thin nozzle. It's kind of like that spray butter you buy at Publix. It becomes aerosolized and then it no longer floats. A fairly small fraction of the oil ever made it to the surface. Most of it was dispersed into tiny droplets, and it's probably still sloshing around down there at somewhere between 1,500 and 1,000 meters depth. It's cold and dark down there, so it doesn't biodegrade like it does where it's warmer and lighter, and so we don't know where that oil is, and there's still a lot of effort going on to try to determine that.
Even though you don't have the funding yet for the hydrocarbon sensors, you're saying that you're trying to track like future oil spills and everything. How is there a way to prevent them? There's really not.
Oh, we certainly would like to prevent them. And in fact, most of obviously the BP spill and some others that resulted from oil drilling were truly catastrophic, but most of the oil that's ever been spilled is from oil tankers, and those oil tankers go everywhere. So providing better information on wind, waves, currents, and tides, or making better nautical charts of where the skinny water is can help prevent those kinds of accidents. In fact, there's a lot of oil drilling in here. There are lots of oil refineries all along this part of the world. All that oil goes around the tip of Florida when it leaves the Gulf of Mexico or through the Yucatan Straits here going to other parts of the world. So regardless of whether or not there's any oil drilling off the coast of Florida, there's still a great danger of future oil spills from shipping accidents. And most of those are due to some sort of human error. So you can give people all the information in the world. If they don't heed it, there still could be an accident. So yes, the goal is to prevent oil spills, but we know we'll never prevent 100% of oil spills.
Any other questions? I was wondering, Mark, all the large tanks and the ships and the cruise ships that are coming into the port, are they being taxed at all or contributing in any way to paying for funding for these systems?
Yes, every ship that comes in pays a port fee. They pay a harbor pilot fee. A portion of those fees are used into a trust fund to help fund the operation of Tampa Bay ports. The Tampa Bay pilots contribute monthly some. Most of the funding for Tampa Bay ports comes from the phosphate industry. There's something called the Phosphate Severance Tax Trust Fund that's basically a tax on all the phosphate that gets shipped out of the Tampa Bay region. And that's where we get the bulk of our funding. We've gotten a lot of funding from the Coastal Protection Trust Fund as well, which is a fee on all the oil that gets shipped into Tampa Bay.
Any other questions? All right, well, before the evaluation, let's give Dr. Luce a big round of applause.
Thank you.